Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Now today we're talking about the beginning of the Cold War. So we are going to be going through the 1940s, a little bit into the 50s, all the way up to 1960 in this one here. We're going to mainly be talking about the Cold War abroad, meaning all across, as a world issue, more so than domestically at home. That's going to be in another virtual classroom. Okay, so let's get into it. So first, World War II ended. And even though steps were taken to ensure that the safety and security around the world, that could not ease the tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. The tensions between these two countries were bigger than ever, and it literally started because of not only just the war, but the very, very end of the war, the atomic bomb. Now, that's something that, of course, the Soviet Union saw and knew that they had to catch up if they wanted to also be a superpower. So there's a few different causes of the Cold War. Now, first is that the plain fact that there's ideological differences between the two countries. The Soviet Union is communist and also a totalitarian state, meaning, again, total control. Again, the state has total control over its citizens, versus the US is democratic and it's a republic that actually has an economic system of capitalism, which is the opposite of communism. So that alone, because they're so different, is going to lead to, of course, really a lot of tension between the two. You're also going to have the fact that the conflict from the end of the war is going to be a big factor. They disagreed over the military strategy in World War II to begin with. Stalin wanted to open up another front in Europe much earlier. Again, FDR wanted Stalin to open up another front when invading Japan. That never happened until, after the atomic bomb dropped and he finally declared war on Japan. Roosevelt didn't trust Stalin. Stalin didn't trust Roosevelt. And guess what? After Roosevelt passes away in April, Harry S. Truman becomes president. And when Harry S. Truman becomes president, he also doesn't trust Stalin. And of course, as we know, Harry S. Truman is the president that decided to drop the atomic bomb on Japan twice, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the U.S. secretly developed the atomic bomb. Soviet Union didn't know we had that. So of course it was a big surprise to the world when it went off, especially to the Soviet Union. So, and there's also post-war disagreements, where Americans feared what Stalin would do in the post-war Eastern Europe. He had promised free elections. Was that going to actually happen? We know today, looking back, it did not happen that way. He did not live up to that promise. So Soviet's action in Eastern Europe was one that was very, very controversial and added to this tension. Stalin promised free elections and self-determination, also known as the right to decide how a nation should be ruled. But he doesn't live up to that. He, again, acts as a totalitarian state and as a dictator and tells them, basically tells them how they're going to be run. Now, Stalin felt he was justified in wanting control of all of Eastern Europe as a defense from Germany and others in the Western Europe. He wanted a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. That buffer zone would be, again, that Eastern Bloc, those Eastern European countries. Stalin also was going to outlaw political parties that opposed communism, jail any type of opponents, rig elections, and often make people disappear. This is a reality, as literally, oftentimes he made it so you would forget about a person's existence. Again, as you can see here, what it comes down to is essentially, Stalin didn't trust anyone around him, and so he's not going to, he's going to go ahead and take out some of these guys simply because he doesn't trust them. Now, soon, almost every Eastern European nation had Stalin or communist-friendly leadership, and this is just going to continue. And as the United States starts to see that communism starting to expand past the Soviet Union into these other countries, all of a sudden we turn our attention to something called containment. We want to contain the spread of communism. Now, meanwhile, the U.S. directly after the war, we have the GI Bill that goes through. It's going to help veterans have a smooth entry into civilian life by providing money to attend college, again, subsidizing loans for housing, finding work, giving them unemployment if they can't find employment, and so on. It's very different, as you remember, with the World War I. They were promised a bonus when they got home, and again, they didn't get that bonus. And then, of course, when the Great Depression came around and they asked for that bonus, they still didn't get that bonus. There was a lot of controversy. Here, it was a much more friendlier, for sure. We're going to have the baby boom as well, which is a dramatic rise in birth rates following the war. Again, the young men are coming home, and 9 months later, there's babies. Then you, of course, have women and industries that are gonna go ahead and make gains in all industries, including manufacturing, especially. Women are going to be now in the workplace more so than ever, thanks to the war effort. So, although that's what's going on at home, and we're going to get more into what happens to the U.S. at home in the 1950s and 60s in our next units, here we look at what's going on with communism. And we see that the Iron Curtain has fallen. Once communism is spread, it's a very sharp, very clear division between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. You can literally see it on the map below. You have the democratic West, you have the communist East. Winston Churchill coined this term Iron Curtain, which is a division of Europe along these ideological lines. Now, the quote here from his Iron Curtain speech is big. Again, as what he says is, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. That's huge that he says that, And behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states, and that, all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to the very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. Now I'm going to give you a minute to read the whole quote, but essentially, what he's saying is the split between free and communist countries is here, right here on this Iron Curtain. So take a moment, pause, and read through that excerpt from the Iron Curtain speech. It is a fantastic speech, but again, just need to look at that excerpt there, okay? All right, you're back. Cool. All right, so again, there's a lot of political cartoons that occur during this time as well. As you can see, that all have to do with the Iron Curtain. Now, there literally was no physical Iron Curtain. There was no iron wall between the East and the West. However, we are going to get the Berlin Wall built in the 1960s. So this is way off from there, okay? This is still the 40s. So it is something that this is a pretend wall that we see in these cartoons. Now, the U.S. response to the Soviet action is very swift. We're in a much better space than we were before the war. Before the war, we were still in the Great Depression. After the war, we come out and emerge as a superpower. And so to combat and halt the spread of communism any further, the U.S. took action. We went ahead and we instituted the policies of containment, which essentially is that the U.S. should resist any Soviet attempts to expand its power and influence. We also had the Truman Doctrine, which in 1947 said it was basically a promise to provide economic and military aid to countries threatened by communism, specifically Greece and Turkey. As Greece and Turkey, as you can see, are very close to the USSR and could have fallen to communism. But if we help them economically, then hopefully they won't. So again, the US intervened with money to stop the Soviet influence, and it worked. So the Cold War strategy as a whole is going to be used by the US to address the devastation in Western Europe following World War II. And that was the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is going to be a US policy, again created by George C. Marshall, going to give $13.4 billion in aid to help rebuild the economies of European countries devastated by World War II in order to create a more stable democratic governments in Europe. And this Marshall Plan is made by George C. Marshall, who was the US Army's chief of staff at the time. So again, East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. Don't forget, we talked about this at the end of World War II, but to recap, Germany after the war was split into 4 sectors. Again, they were governed by France, U.S., Great Britain, and the USSR. Eventually, on May 5th, 1955, the military is no longer going to govern there, and it's going to be held, going to be passed over into civilian hands. So as you can see, the sectors are going to combine to West Germany and East Germany. So you're going to have just West Germany and East Germany. And then from there, even Berlin, the city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, is going to be split within West Berlin and East Berlin. Now that's located inside of East Germany. So what's very interesting is what's going to happen next. And that's the fact that we have a huge crisis right after the war in Germany. Again, a few years after the war, Stalin wanted control of Berlin. It was in East Germany. But remember, he's only going to get he's going to East Berlin is all he's going to have. So the Soviets were upset that democracy was so close to them. So in June of 1948, he sets up a blockade of, again, basically choking out Berlin, blocking roads, rail, river traffic into West Berlin. So West Berliners are cut off from food, coal, and other necessities. So what we do is we complete what they call the Berlin Airlift. For about a year, we finally go ahead, and despite any risks of war that could have occurred, Western nations decided to drop supplies by air on West Berlin. Planes are going to fly every day making deliveries, non-stop. It is said that once a plane touched down, another one was already up in the air. Soviets finally lift the blockade, like I said, around 11 months later. And again, it's 11 months of this, again, just to support these people. It's an incredible feat that those people did, for sure. Now, the Cold War is going to last for several decades. If you want a definition of it, a Cold War is a time of tension and rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now, delegates from the U.S., Great Britain, Soviet Union, and China are all going to meet in 1944 and work out a proposal for the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations is an international organization that's formed to preserve peace, and that's what it does. The UN is still around today. They're going to draw up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a document that guaranteed human rights to the country members of the UN, including all humans are born free and equal, and abolishing slavery. This was definitely in response to the atrocities we are going to see come out of World War II. Now, there are going to be several small hotspots in this Cold War, which never include direct conflict between Americans and Soviets. These are going to be in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba that we're going to be talking about throughout this entirety of this unit. So alliances begin to form, and one is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this is a collection of 26 nations, again, a plethora of them. I couldn't even go through all of them, but they do include the U.S., that basically agree that an armed attack against one member of the nation would be considered attack against all. So it's a much more cohesive alliance. But here's the deal. The Soviet Union is not a part of it. So now the Soviet Union goes ahead and makes their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. Now this is a response, literally a direct response to NATO. The Soviet Union forms its own military alliance with other communist countries and call it the Warsaw Pact. Now, this alliance of the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite nations are going to be, take up a good chunk of them, as you can see here, a good chunk of land. However, it is interesting to see that it was such a response to what NATO was, and that they weren't invited to the party. So, all during this, we are going to have in 1951 a revolution in China. China is going to become communist during this time. The contenders here, you have Mao Zedong and the communists against Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. So a little backstory here. Since the mid-1920s, the nationalists, who are the ones in power, have been fighting against the communists taking over. Now they stopped during World War II because the Japanese are invading, and of course they unite to fight off the Japanese. So World War II has ended now. The nationalists fight the communists. They're back at it. And now the country is struggling economically and politically under the nationalists. So people look for another way, a better way. And so to gain even more support, Mao Zedong makes reforms and includes in these reforms to give peasants land. So now, because again, he's communist. So if he's giving these peasants land, now they're all of a sudden going like, oh, wow, this guy is actually helping us out. So the United States was against China becoming communist, obviously, because, again, containment. We want to contain communism where it already is and not have it spread. So they send military and economic aid. However, even though we have Harry S. Truman and General George C. Marshall of the Marshall Plan over in 1945 to arrange a truce, it doesn't happen. Chiang Kai-shek nor Mao Zedong would compromise. And the winner is Mao Zedong. The communists take over China. Communism is now spreading. So in 1949, Mao Zedong, his forces gain control, and Chiang Kai-shek takes his army and retreats to Taiwan. Now, Mao Zedong and his communists established the People's Republic of China. That's the flag there. That's been since 1949. Now, the U.S. rejects this new government. We don't recognize it. We don't even trade with this new government for quite a while, until, of course, Richard Nixon very famously opens up trade again with China in the 1970s. During this time, we have the Korean War go on shortly after. Now, this is where the Cold War does tend to get a little hot, because although the U.S. wasn't really truly involved in the revolution in China, at least with troops, here we are going to be sending troops into a war zone. So, to give you a background, Korea is divided. Korea was controlled by the Japanese before World War II, and Allied leaders decided that Korea should be free of defeated Japanese control at the Yalta Conference. So, this was supposed to be temporary. It was more than temporary. Koreans on both sides wanted a unified nation. However, it is divided. In fact, it's divided with the communist nation of North Korea, and then in the south, you have the democratic South Korea. Decided to divide at the 38th parallel there. And so the North Koreans were controlled by the Soviet Union, essentially. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is the name of it. And of course, South Korea was controlled by America. So the war starts, and the reason why is because North Korea invades South Korea in hopes of unification. So when the North invades the South, they actually push all the way down to the South with hardly any issue at all. But again, this is now a UN issue, a United Nations issue. So the role of the UN is to go ahead and have police action. Again, you literally have military involvement since there was no declaration of war. Again, essentially a police action. So 40,000 UN troops are going to made up of 15 nations, mostly Americans, are going to go ahead and land in South Korea. The US is going to take a stand against communism, and with South Korea unable to defend itself, they had to show the world that the US was willing to help. Again, especially for other nations. So when the war ensues, again, the North Koreans went ahead, invaded South Korea. Early in the war, they were having tremendous success. They actually pushed the South Koreans very, very south of in the peninsula. And so the U.S. General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, is going to plan an invasion of Icheon. When he does, General MacArthur wanted to go ahead and beat back the North Koreans, and he does. He beats them back past the 38th parallel, all the way up towards the Yalu River, which is actually the border of China and North Korea. He's close. And what happens is General MacArthur wanted to expand the war into Asian mainland, into China. And Truman rejected this because he didn't want another world war. He knew that that is something that could set off a new war. So UN forces had success until the Chinese troops are going to enter the conflict on the side of North Korea. In fact, 260,000 of them are going to go ahead and cross the border. That is going to now drive us back in a large retreat, the largest in history that we've had. We had to retreat all the way down past the 38th parallel. And so it continues right along there. What happens is Truman actually fires General Douglas MacArthur because of him wanting to go ahead and go into China. China isn't directly in the war. They're sending troops to help out the North Koreans. Again, they're both communists. They're allies. So the election occurs. We have Dwight D. Eisenhower that now is elected. This war is continuing on. It's 1952. It's been going on for years. And so Dwight D. Eisenhower elected president on the promise that he was going to end the Korean War. That was one of his things he said when he was campaigning. he actually threatened the use of nuclear weapons in order to go ahead and have an armistice to this thing. So at first, they were very unsuccessful negotiations for peace. There was a disagreement over where the new settlement line would end up anyway. However, finally in 1953, the armistice is reached. When it is, the map of Korea remained almost exactly the same than before the war. So if you looked at the map at the beginning of the war, and the map at the end of the war, it looked very similar. And the Korean War is an example of containment, as the communist North Koreans were technically contained as they didn't spread into South Korea, which again, the initial invasion they did. However, there's going to be 37,000 Americans that are going to be dead by the end of this. More so, there were going to be 3 million Korean civilians killed. Now, we here in the United States kind of see Korea, unfortunately, as a forgotten war. But very much so in the minds of the Koreans, even to this day, that war is still huge. It is a huge war in their history, as it was devastating for them. And the effects of that war is still around today, as we still have a communist North Korea and South Korea that is not united. So the Cold War cools off for a bit. In fact, the 1950s, Joseph Stalin literally dies, and so the leader of the Soviet Union now becomes Nikita Khrushchev. Now, there's a huge importance from both the US and the Soviet Union placed on the atomic energy and nuclear stockpiles as the 1950s progressed. When you look at the chart, you can see that again, building up these nukes in the 50s is going to be a huge part of what their arms race is going to be. An arms race is both of these nations trying to outbuild each other with nukes. Again, trying to one-up one another. Now, in the late 1950s, although all this was going on, relations between the US and the Soviet Union began to warm a little. Okay, began to cool off, get warm. It was a little hot with Korea, just warming down a little bit here, until in May 1960, a US U-2 spy plane goes ahead and crashes in the Soviet Union, causing a recurrence of hard feelings between the two countries. Again, the Soviet Union's like, hey, what were you doing with a spy plane around here? As of course, this is not a good look. Tensions start to rise again, and we're going to see it's going to be John F. Kennedy that's going to go ahead and have to deal with it. As with 1960, we're going to see that Eisenhower is on his way out after his second term. All right, we're going to get into Kennedy and Johnson in our next one. Thanks for joining me. I'll catch you back in the classroom.